Hi, in this video I'd like to talk about how I prepare and write a conference paper for an academic audience. I want to touch on 5 points and I'll do them all pretty briefly. The first thing about writing a paper, a conference paper, is taking into consideration my audience. So most of the time when I'm presenting, it's at a conference, I'm presenting to other academics. Most usually they're in my field, literature, or they might be in allied fields such as art history, philosophy, so in the humanities generally. Um, since this audience is made up primarily of other professors and graduate students, I can assume a pretty strong level of familiarity with some of the concepts I'm working with, but my audience might not be familiar with the texts I'm working with. So in order to make my ideas accessible to my audience, I will either talk through a text that I'm discussing at enough length so that it makes sense to somebody who's listening to a paper. And what I also might do is um, tie what I'm talking about into a more broadly shared text. So if I'm writing about a kind of obscure poem from the 1920s, I might try to tie that to something written by T.S. Eliot or Langston Hughes, for example. The next thing I consider when I'm writing a paper is my level of formality. So if I'm writing something for publication in a journal or a book, that's generally a pretty high level of formality. I try to keep my conference papers a little bit more conversational, and the way I write them, I think about how people can listen to a sentence, so I tend to keep my sentences shorter and more concise. I punctuate the sentences differently than I would for something that's going to be read. I punctuate them so that I pause at the right moments and emphasize things. I'll underline things in the text that I wouldn't underline usually. I'll break up paragraphs in ways that signal to me as I'm reading that I need to stop and let the audience know that I'm sort of changing my topic a little. When it comes time to present the paper itself, I try to read slowly. I try to make eye contact. I think these things are important. Also, if I'm using a PowerPoint presentation, I never ever read the same thing that's on the PowerPoint and I read that off a page. Or if I do, it's just a snippet. But you should never read a long bit of prose off of a PowerPoint presentation because by the time you've read it, your audience has already read it. One last thing that I want to talk about is the way I write a conference paper is I keep the scope of my discussion limited. I don't try to bite off a big, huge topic in a 20-minute paper because I think that people can't listen for more than a few ideas at a time. They can't digest it, and they'll get lost if I try to say too much in a presentation. Again, in something that I write for publication, people can come back to it. They can put the writing down. They can pick it up again. They can follow it more at their leisure. But in a conference presentation, it's a tight, usually 15 to 20-minute schedule, and you want to make sure that your audience can follow you. So that's some of the stuff that I think about when I'm writing a conference presentation. Thank you.